Hip, hip, okay. So hello everyone, welcome at the second and final day of the IndieRE conference. Today we have 4 lectures coming up. The first one will be by Nina Dragičević, and she will talk about audio poverty. And then we also have 3 foreign guests. Irena Šentevska from Belgrade. She will discuss the topic of popular music on the Serbian scene, so to say, and the influence between global and regional influences. And then we have all the way from Glasgow, Scotland, Kate Molson. She'll discuss the topic of hierarchies and genres, I guess that more specifically about classical music. And then finally we have a very special, you could call it a documentary performance called What Is That Stands Before Me? Heavy Metal and Modernism by John Doran and Sefari Goss from London. So a lot of exciting lectures coming up, and thank you for being here and enjoy. Thanks.
Yes. So in the Serbo-Croatian language, there is a brilliant term for what in English is called the throat, especially what is among its possibly less pleasant potential content. What is throat or larynx in English is in Serbo-Croatian grkljan, as if it was announcing a kind of barrier contained in the structure of the throat, as if it should be emphasized that everything will not run smoothly in speech. This is of course related to numerous questions. What are the conditions of speech? Who can speak? How much can they speak? Who are they anyway? And if the speech indeed runs at an obstacle, if it indeed gets stuck, what then? If it for some reason, which reason? If for some reason speech can't arrive at its realization. In other words, what is it that prevents the speech as an event from happening? Questions just keep pouring in. And speech as a space of audible dissemination of articulated thought meets political economy, a space for forming social systems in which thought is articulated and through which social systems are formed. We'll argue here that the speech not happening is an event in itself, and a relevant one for that matter. An attempt to form an event is an event. Human sounding, and therefore also speech, is an area of historical methods of moderation. These are norms that are actively designed within various ideologies and are reproduced in social settings and everyday life. Where at least 2 interlocutors are present, the characteristics of an individual speech act, not only its content, but also its musical properties, duration, amplitude, frequency, risk of being interrupted or taken as irrelevant, correspond to a non-negligible extent with the power relationship between one speaker and another in a specific setting. This relationship is situational, but also historical. Some speech acts are historically more likely to be prevented, interrupted, or taken as irrelevant, as I already said, even to such an extent that they may not seem present at all. Still, the urge to moderate some speech, but not all speech, is not to be perceived as an outdated phenomenon. It is still quite contemporary. For example, when you increase the number of female executive members, if their speaking time isn't restricted to a certain extent, they have difficulty finishing, which is annoying, said the Tokyo Olympics Committee president a couple of years ago in 2021. Or, as another example, Stanford University researcher Catherine Hilton concluded in the 2018 survey that, and I quote, male listeners were more likely to view a female speaker who interrupted as ruder, less friendly, and less intelligent than if the interrupter were male, although both male and female speakers were performing identical scripts. And that finding this gender bias wasn't as surprising as the extent of it, and the fact that it altered perceptions of a female speaker's intelligence, which we don't think of as related to interruptions. So a woman speaker's sonic representation that in script was identical to that of a male speaker made her, in the eyes of the listeners, less intelligent, or more stupid, if you will. There are many such examples. Then there's the example of a US senator telling the CNBC anchor to calm down. Kelly, calm down, he says, and he shushes her. And one of my favorites...
Ms. Ruston, can I ask you, as a woman in the government, your reflections on the culture inside? Has it got better, worse, or no change since the bonk ban era?
Well, Phil, the only thing that I can...
How this ban is referred...
Ms. Ruston, can I ask you...
So, in this case, the Australian minister, Anne Ruston, speaks with the now former Prime Minister Scott Morrison on a press conference where she is asked about her experience as a woman with culture in the government. So the journalist asks the question, Anne Ruston begins to answer, and then this happens. She gets interrupted precisely on the topic of what it means to be a woman in public service. Not that I care very much about politicians in public service. But I love this example, and there are many more such examples. But this here is not a lecture about women being interrupted. The social gender difference common to the cited quotes is only one of the differences that represent a power relationship formed through the listener's interpretation. The interpretation of representation of an individual, which compresses individuals into uniform groups, is presented in the sonic sphere in the form of the allocation of listening attention and the interpretation of a sound event, for example, the use of voice. And so history and everyday life are heavily burdened with stereotypes about the effeminate voices of gay men, the masculine voices of butch women, the excessively loud voices of black women, the too low voices of Roma women, the shrill voices of Jewish people, and so on and so forth. A specific power relationship will be established by the individual's self-articulation, the signs or codes they use, the manner of articulation, and so on, and the interpretation of their representation by the other speaker, as in how we read someone. The effects of the interpretation of representation can be immense. They can define the course of particular lives, one's living standard, access to jobs, the richness of their social life, and so on. In certain situations, such as domestic violence, which is in most cases directed at women, the matter of whether one's audible speech is allowed and regarded as relevant by the state, law, and society can be a matter of life and death. So when a social consensus is established, which puts large numbers of individuals into hermetic groups based on a selective scheme of representational elements, one of them necessarily being the voice, the effects of interpretation affect the dynamics of entire world systems, as in spaces of hegemony, spaces of periphery, etc. The use of voice participates in these processes as one of the representation elements that are available for interpretation. If a voice seems, for example, to be absent, this does not mean its absence. As I was saying, if a voice seems, for example, to be absent, this does not mean its absence, but rather an interpretation that does not perceive the voice as present or relevant. In that sense, the new liberal call to give voice to, say, minorities under the rule of patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity, neoliberal work conditions, etc., is then an absurd one. The individuals or population segments that are suddenly offered a voice were never without one. The call to give voice is then simply a smokescreen to mask what would actually attack the imbalances of power. While the oppressed and the minorities do not need a voice, they would benefit from having listeners, by which I do not mean simply persons who can detect sonic events, but persons who are engaged in a subject sonic performance, persons who invest their interest in listening to a specific subject. It is not given that one's speech is recognized as carrying value, and if so, how much value. Whether a group of people is given voice is never about them. It is always about the dominant group, the group of people with enormous auditory capital. Minorities or any subordinated social groups do not become minorities so much by being deprived of speech, although that process is not to be disregarded, but through auditory deprivation from the dominant side, where the dominant becomes dominant by accumulating auditory capital. So for the dominant to become dominant, certain other speech needs to be dispossessed, but not of speech, but of its potential to be relevantly audible. This process results in certain speech, which is certainly present, being interrupted by the dominant population, ridiculed by the dominant, characterized by the dominant as rude, incapable of influential positions, less intelligent, hysteric, boring, untranslatable, etc. This then directly affects the non-dominant subject's social position, since it is the speech exchange in social settings that intensively participates in constructing social hierarchies. This setting is again not a battlefield for vocality, but a fight for audibility. The appearance of the contemporary social sphere as that of an opening for various voices meets its historical circumstances. Through careful and patient configuration, these have produced a historical norm of a subject sonic appearance, a norm the bars of which are coordinated by the dominant social sphere. In such a liberal call for giving voice, the properties of the speech remain submitted to unchanged criteria and sonic tests of normativity. From there on, the interpretation of one's vocal representation places the individual, by way of the listener's interpretation, into a complex structure of social and power relations. One is placed into what we'd like to call an auditory class. Curiously enough, a deviation from this norm is often not defined as a lack of speech, even though belonging to a group of the oppressed or minority population segments deals primarily with lack. Instead, this deviation is almost exclusively defined as a surplus. Too loud, too quiet, too weird sounding, too shrill, too soft, too urban, too high, too low, too assertive, too timid, and so on. Furthermore, the less power a subject or a group de facto has, the more surplus of speech it is said to have. As we've seen, a subject who, through only listening to their voice, is recognized as a man is, when expressing a relatively high volubility and amplitude, perceived as capable and as a leader, as something positive, while a person who is perceived as a woman is seen to be rude and more stupid, and a black woman as scary. The qualitative evaluation is that of something negative plus surplus progression as we move on the matrix of intersectionality. So we are entering the sphere of auditory economics. As an element of representation, the voice faces dilemmas similar to those of other representation elements. Since there is necessarily interpretation awaiting on the other side, making the voice non-autonomous, obviously, the use of voice leads to carefully defined economic and social possibilities of its subjects of origin. But again, not because of the voice per se, but because of the interpretation scheme the voice faces. Interpretation is formed through listeners' interest, the interest one has in the other's speech and the recognition of its relevance. Nothing without a listener. And so the voice is there. It is being used, but the allocation of the potential of listening to it, which as a power tool resides with the listener, determines the future possibilities of the subject as of the origin of sound. Audibility, which we here extend from the ability to hear, as in perceived with the hearing apparatus, to the potential of being listened to, as in recognized as relevant enough to allocate one's listening interest to it, is, as is now already obvious, determined by the historical auditory classes. That I'm drawing from economic vocabulary is intentional, for it hints at a potentially interesting approach to sounding-listening relations. These have no interesting matter on the level of senses, but only in terms of being relational. They have an interesting matter on the level of class relations. And also, using economic vocabulary intentionally is meant to point out this. Where we operate with a class system, we are dealing with one's threat of falling into poverty. And once we recognize that the voice is not just a simple anatomical given, but an element of representation and interpretation, both operating in the sphere of intersectional social, economic, and political matrix, it becomes necessary to talk about auditory poverty. Here we understand auditory poverty as a theoretical and empirical confrontation with a low allocation of listening potential awarded to the subject as a source of sound. A relatively low level of this potential that one will be listened to defines the possibilities of an individual to articulate their needs and desires, to participate in complex decision-making systems, including those about themselves, to express their fears, for example. The interpretation of one's use of voice then becomes, in historical and current settings, a field of unequal opportunities. An individual can try to influence the properties of their voice with certain efforts, but this results in a new form of subordination, a sonic, a kind of articulatory subordination. An individual placed in a subordinate position by the socially established interpretation of vocal representation either risks auditory poverty or is already under its threshold. But it doesn't end here. An attempt to speak in an unfavorable power position is, as we've already suggested, an event in itself. It is not nothing. Whereas poverty is in the capitalist conditions often seen as a static sphere of inability, in which any attempt to surpass it meets much stronger forces, I suggest that we observe a subordinated individual's attempt to speak as an event. The idea behind this attempt is to surpass the listener's domination, and in that way it presents itself as a force, a vital force, a formation of antagonism, an announcement of conflict. An attempt to make meaningful sound, and an attempt that faces reasonable historical social barriers in particular, contains a sort of imagination, something that allows the speaker, or rather the non-speaker, to imagine that speaking and being perceived as a relevant sounding object is actually possible. This is not to say that the dominant speaker, who is also a listener, should simply shut up for the initial structures of power to shift. Although in some cases this can also be a pretty good idea. The subordinate speaker is, again, not fighting for vocality, but for audibility. The attempt to speak, albeit an unsuccessful one, contains an effort to disrupt the status quo. It aims to defocus and refocus the listener's attention. It is directed not so much at the speaker, but rather at the listener's process of interpretation, even though they might be one and the same person. It can even aim at the previously non-existent audiences by recognizing them as relevant or more relevant than the one's dominant speakers and listeners. Since that speaker is likely to be interpreted as a member of a broader social group, their attempt carries within itself broader consequences. And this force that comprises the attempt to participate in the world audibly was the interest of one of my latest sound compositions, entitled Go. That piece, Go, is part of a series or an opus of compositions entitled If I Do Say So Myself, which also includes the composition Stop, which premiered in the Slovenian Philharmonics a couple of years ago. The composition Stop was interested in recording and writing down hyper-overload, as in overload of work, care work, everyday life tasks, economic precarity, etc., that members of non-dominant social groups or classes face. The basis for the piece Stop was the well-known, commonly used phrase, "I'm drowning in work," and I applied that sentence to the musical composition quite literally. If reading the composition in detail, the performer of the piece, in the end, really finds themselves drowning. This is Irena Šentevska performing that piece. But while this piece stop was created on the plateau of excess, the piece go enters the field of lack or shortage. I imagined spaces and concrete situations where, for at least one individual, the expression of one's thought is either complicated or, under certain conditions, turns out to be completely unfeasible. Everyday life situations come to mind, like participating in an office meeting, a group planning a protest, a social gathering, even a romantic affair. The situations that presuppose the presence of at least one other individual apart from the speaker in question. Otherwise, it would almost always prove irrelevant whether a thought is articulated through sound or not. However, and to avoid any miscommunication, I was not interested in describing the event of non-utterance or non-speech or an attempt, but in writing it down. In that process, it was, of course, impossible to unmoor the composer's point of observation, but it was possible to shift the perspective. The author, who observes a fictional but completely common situation, can only either describe it or write it down retrospectively. Shifting the perspective from the composer's point of view to the individual whose central event is the absence of an event proved to be relevant compositional perspective in this case. Furthermore, events of ineffability or difficult expressibility or utterances that are not recognized as relevant are non-universal, even though they are frequent empirical phenomena. Each event that is a sonic attempt to make a sonic event represents a particular, entirely self-contained space where utterances did and at the same time did not occur. Even more, the combined effect of the ambition to speak, an ambition that faces an obstacle, constitutes both the historical and the future possibility of one's speech. Where impossibility, in other words, or prevention, is reproduced, it just as well might not have been. So, for this composition to be written, it was necessary to recognize non-utterance and the restricted attempt, firstly, as an event, and secondly, as a relevant event. Then a question obviously followed. How will we write down such an attempt? The International Phonetic Alphabet has proven to be helpful in that regard. The IPA represents a standard for recording pronunciation and was applicable in our case mainly because it articulates the complexity of linguistic signs. It tells not only what is spoken, but above all, how it is articulated. In our case, in which at least one interlocutor wants or intends to say something, but cannot and therefore does not say something, but since we have accepted that this is also a speech event, at the same time certainly does say something, the question is no longer what they're trying to say, but how. How does the interlocutor speak the fact that they aren't speaking? It's quite a mess, but an exciting one. The IPA refers to conventional sounding speech events. It defines linguistic signs in writing, which as standalone signs, as standalone signs or as part of a composition with other signs form images from which the reader can derive meaning. In our case, however, we were not recording the conventional semantic signs because they did not happen. Rather, I was interested in what happened precisely when a linguistic sign with conventional meaning did not occur. The IPA thus became the starting point for thinking about an extended way of writing down vocality, namely speech in a musical or even literary composition. Following the principles of IPA, our notation uses known characters to record the properties of speech, such as sounds and phonemes. I made a notation system that uses both relevant IPA characters and, where necessary, I added new ones, or equipped the existing ones with additional properties, with which the performance, the reading of the written composition becomes as precisely defined as possible. For it is these properties that represent a meaningful difference between one non-word and another. We could not be satisfied with, for example, writing down that at a certain moment in the composition the performer, say, breathes. Exactly how they do it was immensely important, as these specifications are, in the end, the musical composition, which by being read is also performed. This is the structural frame for any sign used. So for this composition, this was the structural frame for any sign used in the composition. Here is presented with the example of the letter E, or in Slovenian, E. So it takes some parts from the International Phonetic Alphabet, but adds some that are not in this alphabet. And so our frame for written recording of audible signs defines the physiognomic dynamics that must occur when reading. Does performing a sign occur with the mouth closed or open, for example? Do these take turns? Does the breathing come from the lungs, the throat, or possibly through the teeth? If the reader, the performer, does not have this information, they either cannot read the composition or they likely read it entirely outside the composer's intentions, as they are lacking the context through which to assign meaning to the word, or rather non-word, independently. As a loose analogy, without these specifications, it would be as if the writer of a novel would just take some sentences without any context. While the system for recording attempts to speak has been designed to apply to a remarkably wide range of characters, this does not mean that the range of characters that used in the piece Go is finite or should represent a totality for the reader. It involves only the necessary signs to write down the composition and represents an introduction to what I'd like to call the auditory economy tone system. These are some of the signs that were used. Again, some are directly from the IPA, but some are completely new, but all of them are equipped with physiognomic and other details. Oh, sorry. Yes. So only when it turned out that a sufficiently simple, visually quickly understandable sign was not available, a new sign or a new element was created to define at least one of its properties and to avoid textual description. So we wanted, or I wanted the composition to be written in a way that it does not describe, but that once you know these characters, while you read it, you are already, in a way, performing it. Among such signs that were added in the final composition are the signs for expression that is performed through the teeth, voiceless pronunciation, throat breathing, a held breath, coughing, etc. These are some of the vocal expressions of frustration that results from an attempt to speak not arriving at its desired realization. They are also the expression of strength involved in the very trying to speak. The vocalist Irena Šentevska and I then recorded the audio and video with all the elements necessary to create and perform the piece Go. But here is just a short clip from that video, which records some of the signs shown here or not shown here, I don't know. And from this notation system and these recordings came the composition Go. Here are just 2 pages from the entire piece. Kako to delam? Kje je miška? Earlier, I said that the composition Go enters the zone of lack or scarcity, but this is only partly true. The idea behind this text, this composition, is not the reproduction of the lack of possibilities of utterance, nor the drawing of the limitation of possibilities. What I was interested in was the sound composition of an attempt occurring amid an apparent lack. The attempt to articulate thoughts in the conditions of its prevention is, as mentioned, one of the conditions for the emergence of auditory poverty, or poverty as such, as well as its effect. But it is also a linguistic and auditory way of dealing with it, establishing conflict and disagreement. So I understand it as a relevant speech act. Where it does not result successfully in conventional terms, as in an actual audibly articulated thought, it does not necessarily contain conventional semantic signs, but it certainly contains unconventional ones. But even this is not entirely accurate, because in the human system of expression, these unconventional signs are at the same time distinctly conventional, even completely common. And how they are used is there to produce meaning. The composition Go, written chiefly using such characters, is of course polyphonic, since it considers that the spoken expression of trying is similar to a chord. It is not linear, it is not consequential, many things happen at the same time. The frustration of a realistic, justified expectation of an obstacle and the empirical experience of an obstacle at the moment of attempting is a complex physical experience. The response of the organism that faces the obstacle is immense. There is a cramp, there's tension, a threat of implosion, a threat of explosion. If the subject of the composition seems blocked, silenced, or interrupted, in some other perspective, it proves to be something else. A throat, a larynx, grkljan, with all its consonantal obstacles. A speaker who in conventional terms is unsuccessful, but nevertheless speaks. So the weight of the problem of auditory poverty is then not on the non-speaker, but on the composer and the listener. And to sum up, the history is full of examples of subordinate speakers who try to solve their auditory obstacles by leaning in, by trying to adapt to their sonic norm. Margaret Thatcher, the epitome of anti-feminism, reportedly used voice training to climb out of her auditory class. We can notice many other ways of active participation in auditory class economies, especially in the production of auditory poverty. In the last 10 years, in private conversations or on the public stage, I have met dozens of people, let's say specifically women, sound artists, who work in various segments of musical creativity in Slovenia. I've learned a lot by listening to them. And so I know exactly who among them was harassed by producers, who did not land this or that job, especially a job in the music field. I know who among these artists has lower incomes because of gender-based discrimination. And I know who rarely receives any income with their artistic work. I know who among them had almost succeeded, but then did not. I also know that, apart from rare exceptions, none of them has ever expressed their position in public. Their horror stories are told in private, while on stage, in public space, suddenly everything seems okay, and the critical speech ceases to exist. Even the attempt to speak is, on numerous occasions, self-prevented. I can understand this. There's fear of being ridiculed, ignored, and disregarded because of the listener's performed voice interpretation mechanism. One can even be explicitly sanctioned for audibly articulating one's critique of the complex class systems, the auditory class system just being one of them. The part of the population that is subjected to auditory disciplining and is chained to a specific auditory class, to the moderation of auditory potential and to severe listening disinterest, often reacts to that by self-moderation, self-discipline, minimization of their sonic auditory potential and adaptation to the auditory patriarchal system. The pursuit of sonic moderation is not an endpoint. Accepting it as a fact and as something with no substantial consequences is. Now, as a final sentence, I have no desire to speak in prescriptive terms here or elsewhere. But imagine, just imagine, if all who are the so-called other placed as much effort in their auditory poverty as they are concerned with their economic one, realizing they are one and the same thing. Now that would be, in my opinion, something worth talking about. Thank you.
Do we maybe have any questions from the audience? I might have one, Nina. Would you say that this theory is also applicable on the relationship between the so-called received, I mean the official language and dialects and so on when it comes to like political tensions between people from the periphery and the center? I don't know if I was clear enough.
Yeah, I think I understand you. This specifically hasn't been yet or at all a point of my interest, but I suppose that anything that has to do with representing oneself with one's voice is at least to some extent faces the same kind of dilemmas or problems. So whenever one person represents themselves in a space, they are treated as something, right? Not in sense of there being their authentic self, as now the popular magazines are calling it, but precisely from the other sides, as in from how they are perceived. So when another speaker, as I mentioned from in one of the researches, so if I speak, who am perceived as a woman, this has nothing to do with how I identify, and this is the same if you speak in a certain dialect. So you maybe perhaps not at all identify with a certain space or the dialect or whatever, but the fact is one will be treated on that basis. So I suppose that it could be used on the same topic. My main idea here, and in the book that I wrote about this recently, is that sound studies have been now a big topic for almost, let's say, I don't know, 15 or 20 years. But it seems to me that they're always on a kind of a slippery slope. It's very easy to move them into the sphere of, senses or something, like very ephemeral, how someone feels and so on. Whereas I think that we could benefit, or it could be useful to think about it through through some kind of a sound studies critical theory, so to speak, right? So to understand that just the same as one's visual appearance or any kind of presentation affects their lives, and by extension, larger groups of people's lives, it's the same with voice, or at least similar to some extent. I hope I answered your question. Yeah. Thank you.
So there is no...
Say something. Do you have any more specific examples of this your general idea which you presented today in our local area?
Well, I'm sure these things happen every day, and it would be probably pretty easy to find them because they're really common, right? So, but then again, it's also this whole thing is also a matter of how we analyze such examples, right? What really comes to mind is, you probably know the show on the Slovenian television called Tarča. I find this show to be really interesting. I'm not really a fan of it. I don't watch it often, but I sometimes sort of force myself to watch it when there are also women politicians present, because I find it interesting to observe how much speaking time someone gets. And mind you, the presenter is Irena Šentevska, who is also perceived as a woman, so this doesn't matter, right? And in my assessment, but I think this would deserve a specific analysis, is that there are also similar kinds of interruptions taking place, some persons getting a lot less speaking time than other persons, and so on. So I suppose we can notice this anywhere. You can just sit in a bar, and which I often do, and just observe how people speak to each other, how some relations are constantly formed. So the fact that some power relations are formed, it's a fact, you know.
I think that it depends not only on gender, but also on what they are talking, because maybe what they say is not so much relevant for the theme they are talking about.
Well, first of all, let me just emphasize we have to be really, really specific here if we are discussing this topic. I mentioned several times that this is not a lecture about women. So I just took one example. This example could be more complicated in terms of, you know, including race and ethnicity and whatever into the conversation. But again, your comment that everything also is related to what one person is speaking about, this raises just another question. So who decides what is relevant, right? In a certain setting, we could all decide that someone here is not speaking anything relevant, or we could just not do that. So as I said, these are really complex things, you know. I just presented a very basic introduction to it.
I find very interesting your part where you're talking about the pitch of the voice. Can you tell us maybe something more about it? Because I think it's very important, the pitch of the voice.
Oh, you could just go listen to Wagner's operas and you could get an entire idea about it, for example. But yeah, I'm mentioning the pitch as just one of the physical elements of a sonic act, right? So it's not the only one that is important. And I repeat again, this is every situation is very complex, and you cannot just speak about one level, one element of it. But maybe this is also why I decided to today include the examples of gender difference, because it's such an obvious one. So what does a higher voice imply and a lower voice? So yeah.
Yeah, because we can follow the selection of the journalists on the TV, for example, here, our TV of Slovenia, they have more or less the same pitch and the same way of talking. So this is very important. I think the implication of who decide to make us listen to this very pitch and way of talking
This could also become a discussion similar to those about musical genres and so on. So there's some consensus that the society makes about what is the real deal at some moment, and this also in the television and radio changes through time. So what kinds of voices are usually presented. What I find very interesting, especially in the context of national radios, is how so maybe someone can correct me, but as I've been told several times, is that one will have a very hard time becoming a speaker on the radio, on the national radio, And this does not also mean for example, Radio Študent, which operates in a completely different way, that if you have any kind of so-called speech impairment, this directly, immediately disqualifies you, you know? So for example, I have my specific R, which would mean that I cannot work there, but I can work on another radio, such as Radio Študent. So this then becomes, these then become cases for discussion. What distinguishes one and the other? This question, the answer to this question can be fairly simple and obvious, but also a complex one.
If there are no more questions, we continue at 3:15, and you're welcome to join us at the museum hall because we have a buffet, so you can grab something to eat. Thank you, Nina.
Hvala.
Ništa, jer meni treba samo ovde jedno. Ima puno fotki, ima preko, ja mislim, 160. Dobro. Okay, I guess it's time to start. This is something completely different to what we had in the previous session. After Nina's inspiring talk, I will really find it hard to follow up with this story, which is basically a long historical journey that will take us to the point where we can somehow see why the popular music scene in Serbia looks like as it looks like or sounds like today. So I will start this talk by saying a few things about the book Raspevani Beograd, Singing Belgrade, launched 10 months ago by the publishing house CLIO from Belgrade. This book contains most of the material that I will be presenting today. For those of you who are hypothetically, potentially interested in reading the whole thing in the original language, which is Serbian, of course, the book is available through CLIO's website. Singing Belgrade focuses on the way in which music videos as a media form reflect the urban transformations and construction of urban identity of Belgrade in the period of rapid transformations in the sphere of politics, economy, and culture in the period from 1980 to 2010. Belgrade entered this period as a capital of a socialist multi-ethnic federation. At the end of this period, Belgrade was already a capital of the mono-ethnic state with underdeveloped and neoliberal capitalist economy that we know today. The 1980s were the last decade of socialist Yugoslavia. The 1990s were a period of grave social crisis in Serbia and war in former Yugoslavia, orchestrated by the regime of Slobodan Milošević. The 2000s were a period of consolidation and construction of the new post-Yugoslav identity in Serbia. In this book, I looked at these transformations from a rather unconventional perspective by studying music videos. The book itself has 3 main chapters, each dedicated to a respective music meta-genre. Thus, the pink chapter deals with the so-called newly composed folk music and its historic legacy, the so-called turbo folk. The black chapter discusses rock culture in general and the genres of popular music imported in Serbia directly from the West, whereas the gray chapter, due to the specific genre conventions referring to music videos, focuses on hip-hop. According to British cultural theorist Stuart Hall, the processes of identification generally entail binding and marking of symbolic boundaries, the production of frontier effects between individuals or social groups. Quote, identities can function as points of identification and attachment only because of their capacity to exclude, to leave out, to render outside objected, end quote. In different fields of humanities, music is recognized as an effective medium for expression of socio-cultural otherness, instrumental in the very processes of othering. Music is an idea, a social and cultural phenomenon, which communicates socially and culturally understandable messages, also to those who lack musical education, like myself, but are able to form an attitude towards certain types of music. My book deals with the role of popular music in the construction of urban identity of Belgrade and addresses the way in which particular music genres and value systems associated with them, their ethics and aesthetics, draw invisible borders in the society. I wanted to demonstrate that the reasons behind these wars on symbolic borders far surpass the domain of musical creativity, leisure, entertainment, and consumption. In the last several decades, in the gray zone of production of knowledge and popular culture, the debates about the music blasting from nightclubs, cars, and mobile phones have served as battleground for ideological struggle for symbolic capital in the processes of restructuring and restratification of the Serbian society. These debates have an active role in the shaping and transformation of social values, not only in Serbia, but also in the countries of the so-called region, which certainly includes Slovenia. Hopefully, that's why I'm here today. I will start from the 1960s. An early Belgrade beat band, Zlatni Dečaci, had a version of the Macedonian folk song Jovano Jovanke, which was better received by English audiences in 1966 than their standard rock repertoire of the period. In fact, Zlatni Dečaci, the Golden Boys, reached England owing to Nikola Karaklajić, a radio host and early supporter of rock on the airwaves of Radio Belgrade, who was also an international chess master. Invited to a chess tournament in Sussex, Bognor Regis to be precise, Karaklajić presented the Golden Boys as young chess players in order to speed up the process of obtaining their visas. As ambassadors of rock and roll on the home front, Zlatni Dečaci legitimized the new musical culture, not only with numbers like Foxtrot Oriental, but also with records containing rock covers of classical pieces. Zlatni Dečaci were criticized for compromising their integrity as a rock band because of their flirting with folk and classical music. So the media strategy of the band was described at the time by their lead singer Boba Stefanović as follows. It was forbidden to play rock music at the time. Shaggies, Čupavci, were chased in the streets and their hair was cut off. My pal Borko, Velibor Kacel, and I had an idea how to legalize our music and enter Radio Belgrade. We covered a number of classical pieces. Our colleagues can only owe us a debt of gratitude for opening the doors of the radio and TV studios for them. Before us, no band or vocal instrumental group, as they were called at the time, had ever appeared on a radio program. Owing to Nikola Karaklajić taking part in another chess tournament in the Netherlands, in 1965, Zlatni Dečaci released a record under the name The Golden Boys for the Dutch record company Fontana. However, no one in Yugoslavia showed any interest in importing and selling these records. According to Karaklajić, this was a unique phenomenon, that one of our groups should release its first record abroad and only later at home. Nevertheless, at the same time, it revealed the state of mind of the home market. Enormous distrust on the part of the producers in the young generation and its music. According to Siniša Škarica, a long-time producer and music executive at the record company Jugoton, fellow media executives who worked with young rock musicians in the early 1960s, wary of Americanization, insisted on recording their own or Yugoslav original compositions. This also included newly composed songs or covers of folk or classical motifs. Škarica cited many examples of complying bands, from Bijele Strijele, Sjene, Atomi, and Mladi to Zlatni Dečaci, Crveni koralje, and Iskre. The song Osmijeh by Drago Mlinarec and his band, recorded in late 1966 in the studio of Radio Zagreb, is considered to be the first rock hit written by a Yugoslav rock musician. The song achieved such popularity that other bands included this song in their repertoire, as the first such example in the Yugoslav context. The song was also popular at the dance parties Igranke, where previously only international hits were appreciated and enjoyed by the dancers. What made the popular music scene in Sarajevo unique in the Yugoslav context was the early rock musicians' insistence on authorship and originality, along with singing in the native language. This demand actually came from the executives in the relatively underdeveloped local media and recording industry. Ljudi, dajte nešto svoje. People, bring us something of your own stuff. was a paradigmatic call to young rockers that came from Esad Arnautalić, composer, producer, and music editor at Radio Sarajevo. Arnautalić was also the founder of the music production department at Radio Sarajevo and founder of the music festival Vaš lager sezone. Though responsible for the mega successful version of the French Eurovision chanson Elle était si jolie, Bila je tako lijepa, performed by Dragan Stojnić, as an early Yugoslav popular music hit which came from Sarajevo, Arnautalić decided that the city should have its own original music. He said, "Anyone who has something of his own, let him bring it in. Anyone who doesn't, so long. Ko ima nešto svoje, nek donese. Ko nema, vozdra." Esad's brother, Ismet Nuno Arnautalić, was a founding member of the band Indexi. Indexi responded promptly to Esad's call, and their entire repertoire was soon in Serbo-Croatian. In other words, the reproductive rock culture of the time was not well appreciated in the media outlets in Sarajevo. However, although this policy encouraged originality and authorship, a lot of local musical talent was lost due to the lack of infrastructure for the music industry. Sarajevo did not have a record company until Discourses was founded in 1973, which is one of the reasons why many pioneers of rock and pop music moved from Sarajevo to Yugoslav centers, which provided more opportunities for music professionals, mainly Belgrade and Zagreb. The early manifestations of rock culture reflected a cultural clash between the global and the local. Following the current Gitarijada trend, Gitarijada were festivals of young unsigned bands, Sarajevo held its own Gitarijada in March 1967 under the title Electricity Threatens Sevdah. The whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina under 220 volts. Debates on the social position and political influence of the rock scene in socialist Yugoslavia have put forward various and often conflicting interpretations of the use and the role of folkloric motifs in the creative output of Yugoslav rock musicians. In spite of the considerable differences between the decades, in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, some rock bands, such as U Grupa, Korni Grupa, S vremena na vreme, Smak, Bijelo dugme, or Lebi Sol, used folkloric elements in spontaneous attempts to attract audiences with music that more or less already had a strong presence in their lives. These groups sought to expand their audience base to segments of the youth population that favored folk music idioms. This strategy was also helpful in dealing with the music executives at the broadcasters and record companies. At the same time, such nostrification was an asset in overcoming the ideologically driven resistance to rock and roll, which was often perceived from different sides in the socialist society as an alien and decadent form of Western popular culture. In the socialist context, rock music, incorporating folkloric elements, assumed two basic roles: domestication of rock and roll as a cluster of imported Western music idioms, lifestyles, and value systems, largely in disharmony with the social order in the Eastern Bloc countries, not excluding Yugoslavia. The other role was mediation of the national belonging, where rock music could perform both centrifugal and centripetal functions in asserting unitary or separate ethnic identities. In the Yugoslav context, this meant that both ethno-revival as a loosely defined music genre and the occasional use of folklore in rock genres, not necessarily defined as ethno, could promote both unitary Yugoslav and separate ethnic or regional identities, often at the same time. Ethno-national or traditional patterns could manifest in the realm of popular music cultures, rock included, in different ways across the continents. In the early rock repertoire around the world, the salient ethno-national elements may have comprised singing in the native languages or references in the lyrics to subjects emanating from local realities. These practices would often include use of native instruments, sometimes electrified, indigenous vocal techniques, of enunciation through singing and rhythmic patterns, and undoubtedly rock covers of traditional music themes. Israeli sociologist Moti Regev developed a universal model of the transformation of ethno-national cultural uniqueness in musical traditions through rock music. He outlined 4 phases of this process. Phase 1, prehistory, Elvis and beat band imitations. Do you recognize the band? Forza Copper. Phase 2, consecrated a mythical beginning, local music inspired by the Beatles, Bob Dylan, folk rock, psychedelia, and prog rock, etc. Phase 3, consolidation and dominance, joining ranks with traditional national music, local new wave, rockization of pop, etc. Phase 4, diversification, internationalization through genres like hip-hop, electronica, metal, international success and recognition. According to Regev, what preceded this process of domestication of rock music in the non-Western realm, he discusses the cases of Israel and Argentina, was an emphasis on indigenous popular and folk music traditions. The outcome of this process, among others, is openness to constant stylistic influences from the outside, which he calls aesthetic cosmopolitanism. In the context of the cultural appropriation of rock and roll, this meant that non-British and American audiences developed a sense of ownership rather similar to that of its native public in the UK and US. Rock and roll had become their music, a marker of generational time and identity. In Yugoslavia, Bijelo dugme's indigenous stylistic developments to some extent undermined the relevance of American and British pop rock for the local audiences. In socialist Yugoslavia, a specific kind of post-war urbanization brought rural immigrants to the centers of cities as representatives of new political and social power. In the 1950s, with the industrialization in full swing, many predominantly young people from the rural parts of the country moved to the cities to work or study. They shared the dominant value, which could be best described as an urgent desire to get rid of the village. In other words, to wipe out all traces of peasant origin and become urbanized as soon as possible. This desire was reinforced by the official ideology and agenda of development, which did not at the time rely on agriculture. The 1964 release of Lepo Lukić's single Od izvora vode dva putića marked the symbolical beginning of the new era of commercial expansion of the newly composed folk music, ritually panned by intellectuals and cultural officials as a caricature of authentic folklore. The folkloric background and strong ties with the both pre-modern rituals, such as rural weddings and holidays, and contemporary leisure, made this music genre hugely popular and commercially dominant in the music industry of socialist Yugoslavia. Commercial success and social significance of the newly composed folk music, both in the rural and urban contexts, became the most striking symptom of the political failure of socialist cultural policies. Apart from that, the genre was perceived as reinforcing perceptions of core cultural differences between the Balkans and Western Europe, namely between Yugoslavia's eastern republics, where its audience and production was more concentrated, and the Western republics, where it lacked a proper foothold and audience base. Economic reforms associated with the introduction of self-management in Yugoslavia led to a specific form of democratization of popular music practices. Unlike the public radio and TV stations, the leading record companies in Yugoslavia, Jugoton from Zagreb, PGP RTB from Belgrade, or Discourses from Sarajevo, enjoyed modest material support from the state. However, with the systematic introduction of some elements of market economy, The record companies also had to resort to self-generated profits and work with commercially successful performers. Such performers were mainly singers of newly composed folk music. This music was a powerful economic factor which connected record companies from different parts of Yugoslavia and shaped its music industry. For example, out of the 729 records released in Yugoslavia in 1972, 427 featured neo-folk performers. In the mid-1980s, neo-folk accounted for 58% of the total output of Yugoslav music industry. And neo-folk only gained in popularity with the growth of popular press and local radio stations. In Serbia only, between 1962 and 1972, some 20 stations were launched. In the late 1960s, pirate radio stations also began to emerge, featuring light music and neo-folk songs at the listeners' requests. They were seen as local responses to the difficult access to broadcasts of the official radio stations or manifestation of the overall disappointment with them. The concept of culture in a socialist society firmly stood for accessibility, humanist principle, and above all, artistic values. Upon the revolutionary peasantry expected to evolve into the working class, the ideology of progress imposed the need of modern cultural institutions. The traditional peasantry and this emerging class were expected not only to depart from their old ways and embrace modernized and urbanized modes of cultural consumption, but also to develop appreciation for artistic values. In this very aspect of cultural consumption, the rural and semi-rural masses most visibly failed to meet the guidelines of socialist cultural policies. As a result, newspaper stories like the 1962 Borba's report on the Serbian village of Kusadak, whose folk allegedly preferred jazz to folk music, remained in the sphere of media curiosities. At that time, this village's folk owned some 500 radios, 2 public and 4 privately owned TV sets. More than 20 years later, in 1983, when sociologist Branimir Stojković looked at the representations of mass culture in the influential youth journal Student, he noted a total absence of neo-folk music from that picture. According to Student, this realm of music life, which is arguably the main preference of the solid majority of this country's population, does not even possess a negative relevance, namely, as music, it simply doesn't exist. In spite of being the prevailing form of mass culture in Yugoslavia, neo-folk music firmly remained on the margins of academic interests. This music had a past, but not a history. This attitude toward the neo-folk music reflects a culturally specific perception of history as an exclusive domain of cultural value. Indeed, while the leading composers of light music, zabavna muzika, were officially acknowledged, they could be regular members of the Union of Yugoslav Composers. This acknowledgement was denied to the creators of neo-folk music. Apart from a handful of privileged protagonists, the cultural discrimination against the genre occasionally assumed even inhuman aspects. When in 1976, Silvana Armenulić, a true diva of neo-folk music, died in a car accident with her sister Mirjana Mirsada Barjaktarević, the nation was in mourning. However, state television's primetime news announced only the death of a fellow musician, Rade Jašarević, who was in the same car with the sisters, both neo-folk singers. Namely, Jašarević was the head of the radio television Belgrade's folk music orchestra and therefore referred to in the news in the socialist era parlance as a member of RTB's working collective. So, we're moving in time. Evolution of the newly composed folk music into the so-called turbo folk in the early 1990s was marked by arbitrary blends of the local folkloric and global pop music idioms. against the background of the new transitional economy and deregulated media industries and markets. The term itself comes from the early stages of the career of the Belgrade-based conceptual pop artist Rambo Amadeus, equally known for his music experiments and his verbal theatrics. The heavy media exposure of turbo folk in the 1990s provoked numerous commentators to label this phenomenon as a camouflage of the harsh social reality in Serbia, which included UN economic sanctions, armed conflicts with neighboring countries of the former Yugoslavia, and economic downfall by means of the pink imagery of compulsive entertainment. Turbo folk, the soundtrack of the Milosevic regime, was accordingly understood as music for gangsters who made a fortune through war profiteering. In various scholarly interpretations, turbo folk became the music of Serbia's isolation, a sexy accompaniment to Serbian nationalism, a catalyst for pro-fascist sentiments, even music of ethnic cleansing. Accordingly, in this reading, turbo folk aided in redefining and homogenizing the Serbian national identity and in denying war trauma in other parts of the former Yugoslavia. Serbian media scholar Ivana Kronja also thinks that probably the best definition of turbo folk is porno pop music. Turbo folk released itself from the stigma of the music of war attached to it in the 1990s with considerable difficulty. Even international admirers of turbo folk, like the cyberpunk author Bruce Sterling, mainly praised its loving relationship between music and terrorism. Moreover, the love between the singer Svetlana Veličković-Ceca and mobster and paramilitary leader Željko Ražnatović-Arkan, crowned in marriage in 1995, symbolized the relationship between turbo folk, state-controlled media, and the new criminalized Serbian elites. With the dissolution of socialist Yugoslavia and armed conflicts throughout its former territory, the already well-elaborated Orientalist discourse of neo-folk contamination assumed a new political context. In Serbia, invading hordes of Janissaries, which disrupt the national soundscape with annoying Anatolian howling and as our national misfortune, and similar constructs were no longer metaphorical expressions of musical dislike. The war was very real, and attempts at deorientalization of Serbian folk music obtained firm political ground. In a famous example, Serbian opposition MP Pavle Aksentijević, a notable singer of medieval spiritual music, at the July 1994 parliament session, brought a tape recorder to the podium and played the tape of an allegedly Iranian popular song. Then he played a song by Dragana Mirković, one of the prima donnas of turbo folk, attempting to demonstrate that the tunes were almost identical. Dragana actually did a cover of Didi, song Didi, international hit by the Algerian Rai star Khaled. At the same time, during this parliament situation, Pavle Aksentijevic's political opponent, mayor of small town of Svilajnac, this is Khaled, and this is mayor of small town of Svilajnac, and the representative of the ruling Socialist Party of Serbia, Dobrivoje Budimirović Bidža, was happily belly dancing. Aksentijević concluded this performance in the parliament by quoting the communist historian Vladimir Dedijer. "We Serbs sometimes behave as we were begotten by drunken Turks." Namely, turbo folk's grassroots character, un-European origins, and failure to conform to Western standards of legitimate culture made turbo folk such a contested and controversial cultural product in the eyes of the Serbian cultural gatekeepers. Misha Đurković therefore suggests that turbo folk should be considered rather as an ideological label than as a genre of music. Nevertheless, during the armed conflicts throughout former Yugoslavia, the war zone reality revealed somewhat surprising music preferences. Under the siege of Sarajevo, when asked why he sold the music of Svetlana Ražnatović Ceca, a marker seller famously retorted, "Art knows no borders. Umjetnost nema granica." As noted by Zoran Čirjaković, Turbo folk was the only Serb product that the suffering and almost ethnically clean post-war Sarajevo yearned for. The nations dominating the first Yugoslav state from 1980 to World War II, namely Serb, Croats, and Slovenes, or being fully recognized in the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, such as Montenegrins, Macedonians, ethnic Muslims, and ethnic Albanian minority, certainly had very different music traditions. Milica Bakić-Hayden's concept of nesting Orientalism, a tendency for each region to view cultures and religions to the south and east of it as more conservative or primitive, was famously illustrated by Slavoj Žižek. For right-wing nationalist Austrians, the imaginary frontier is Karavanke. Beyond it, the Slavic hordes rule. For the nationalist Slovenes, the frontier is the river Kolpa. They are Mittel Europa, while Croats are already Balkan, involved in the irrational ethnic feuds which really do not concern the Slovenes. For Croats, the crucial frontier is the one between them and Serbs, etc. Moreover, this imaginary cartography far outstretches the blurry frontiers of the Balkans to embrace all of Europe. In the post-Yugoslav context, the contaminated Turbo folk culture operates as a symptom, propelling another version of nesting Orientalism. Here, each cultural barricade is again seen as a defense against the threats from the East. On the one hand, Serbia must preserve its integrity against Turkish or Islamic-sounding music to prevent the Teheranization of Belgrade. On the other hand, in Croatia, Turbo folk is associated with Serbia and its inner Orient, Serbian ethnic minority, and treated as a cultural, social, and political phenomenon non-recommendable for a wider audience. As for Slovenia, whereas Turbo folk is still perceived as undeserving of official academic events in Serbia and Croatia, its presence and relevance in the indisputably European host country of this conference can be illustrated by the fact that the Department of Cultural Studies in Ljubljana's Faculty of Social Sciences celebrated its 10th anniversary in 2005 with a symposium titled Turbo Folk Among the Slovenes. In addition to the Serbo-Croat dispute over Turbo Folk, similar music performs similar scapegoat roles throughout the Balkans and the Middle East. Bulgarian Chalga, Romanian Musica Orientala, Greekski Ladiko, Turkish Arabesque, Israeli Mizrahi, etc. As noted by Princeton scholar Margaret Beisinger, in the respective local contexts, such music genres are mostly criticized by those who relish Western European and American popular music without seeing the irony within their own perception of what foreign means. At the first anti-war concerts in Serbia, rock musicians expressed their resentment of Milošević's warmongering politics with the message "Nećemo da pobedi narodna muzika." We don't want folk music to prevail. When the Turbo folk star Dragan Kojić Keba offered to express his support for the students' anti-government protests in 1996 with a concert gig, his offer was politely refused and his complimentary CD was not played at the rallies. Eventually, this oversimplified formula, a rock good, turbo folk bad, proved to be rather misleading, as proponents of the same musical genre more often than not adopted ideologically opposite positions. Late Bora Đorđević, who recently died here in Ljubljana, was probably the best example of this. One consequence of the overall social turmoil in the 1990s was the omnipresent and unsanctioned skull and crossbones piracy culture, which nevertheless had somewhat positive effects on the Serbian music scene. On the one hand, it helped the otherwise obstructed exchange of music and information between the former Yugoslav republics. And on the other hand, it helped the isolated and economically deprived consumers and music makers to acquire new, albeit bootleg, music releases at affordable prices. We can't complain about bootlegs, said rapper Đorđe Jovanović from the group Beogradski Sindikat. Musicians buy pirate CDs as well. Under the UN sanctions and overall isolation, Serbia saw an apparently paradoxical process of outer closing and inner opening of the music scene. Nevertheless, the effects on the less commercial music genres were disastrous, forcing them to sink towards the underground. This accorded with the widespread impression that Serbian rock scene was not destroyed deliberately by the regime, but collapsed by itself, non-commercial as it was and unattractive both to the regime and to the mass audiences. The transformations that shaped turbo folk as a music genre and industry, transformations of the media systems, record companies, touring management, and advertising of music products, have their roots in broader transformations of the global economy, politics, and media. During the post-socialist period in Serbia, turbo folk found itself torn between the aggressive crypto-colonial national culture emulating Western models and the new local neoliberal economy marked by massive economic dependence on the West. In this crypto-colonial context, turbo folk became a mirror of globalization, a mishmash of musical styles that colonized the music formerly known in Yugoslavia as newly composed folk music, and the dominant mass cultural model associated with it. The chaotic political and economic situation in Serbia changed only partially with the ousting of Slobodan Milošević in 2000 and his retirement from the political scene into the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague. In the words of Zoran Radović, frontman of the rock band Pressing, the people who decide what is going to be released or played in the media don't think that what we do should be dominant or even exposed too much. When they built a new Serbian culture over the last decade, and even after the political changes, they used an architecture to build a house that put us in the basement. The fate of Pressing's album, Šesto nebo, Sixth Heaven, released in 2002, is a telling story about the state of the Serbian music industry in the early 2000s. The album had glowing reviews as the most important artifact of Serbian culture in the past year, or one of the 5 best albums to come out of Central Europe in the last decade. Nevertheless, this success had not translated into sales, which were hovering in the low 3 digits. The band's member, Vlada Marković, said, "We are getting incredible feedback from the press. We have been #1 on various radio lists and our video has been played. But sales are nothing, distribution is nothing, and concerts aren't happening." He explained that touring in support of their album in Serbia and Montenegro would not even pay for itself. Gasoline costs more than one gets from the gig, because the ticket price in most cities is too low. It cannot be increased due to the poor state of the local economies. In the early 2000s, performers from Serbia still met numerous administrative obstacles in other countries of the region, which are their potential markets. Visas, work permits, etc., including the impossibility to distribute their releases legally. As a result, ignored by the commercial media, this forcibly underground scene was left at the mercy of corporate sponsors, mostly manufacturers of risky substances, alcohol and cigarettes, with restricted possibilities of advertising. In such circumstances, even the rise of the DJ culture happened to be an outcome of the economic fact that it is considerably cheaper to host a single DJ than a touring band. The new political constellation in Serbia redesigned the media landscape and established the new economic reality of the post-Milosevic era. Its major novelty was the emergence of large-scale entrepreneurs who introduced the Serbian economy into the era of tycoon capitalism, marked by privatization of public resources, offshore business deals, healthy competition of corporate and administrative powers, and excessive consumption. Restructuring of the economy resulted in further fragmentations of the media market. With the rise of the internet as a powerful medium for advertising music products, the importance of television and radio for young consumers and their music programs had steadily declined in favor of the increasing range of services of the mobile telephony and specialized web portals. To give an entertaining example, the convergence between the mobile telephony and music industry was aptly described in the song Mobilni telefon by the underground folk singer Lasar Topalović Brka, who says that every morning at the break of dawn, his mobile phone wakes him up with the song. Mobilni telefon, kad zora zarudi, mobilni telefon, on me pesmom budi. In this new business environment, certain media outlets in Serbia, previously perceived as countercultural and socially critical, like radio or later TV B92, assumed new roles, becoming pillars of social conformism and consumer individualism. If we just look at the history of music videos as a means of advertising of music products in the Serbian context, we shall discover much more. In the socialist 1980s, music videos were predominantly produced by the relatively rigid system of public television broadcasting. In the context of low competitiveness, both in the national economy and the music market, public television only exceptionally used music videos for advertising commercial products. This situation changed visibly in the early 1990s with the rapid deregulation of media systems and Serbia's return to the market economy. Among the newly launched broadcasting companies, music videos became a popular and inexpensive segment of the airplay. At the same time, they began to serve their initial purpose, to advertise new music releases and talents. In addition, and with growing frequency, they began to integrate commercial brands. In the chaotic circumstances of Serbia's wartime economy, UN sanctions, spirals of inflation, mass impoverishment, unemployment, and other symptoms of economic crisis, advertising per se had questionable commercial effects. So did music videos. Due to the global developments in the media systems, such as emergence of internet as the prime medium for watching music videos, their TV airplay is constantly shrinking and the standards of their technical production are rapidly rising along with the fans' expectations. This makes music videos at the same time more expensive and less economically viable, which results in the common practice of joint sponsorships. An overview of a considerable portion of the music video production in Serbia would show large amounts of alcohol, non-alcoholic beverages, and bottled water. Bare necessities such as food products, fashion items, cosmetics, and consumer electronics, especially mobile phones, appear in them with increasing visibility. In accordance with the symbolical status attached to cars, not only in the Serbian social context, music videos of all commercial genres abound with car imagery. As travels and holidays represent another mark of social distinction in a largely deprived society, Serbian artists make significant contributions to promoting the national tourist infrastructure. The widespread practice of joint sponsorships of music videos brings together yogurts and shampoos, condoms and batteries, HIV tests and jewelry, alcohol and detergents, cars and mobile phones. It often happens that advertisers willing and able to invest in music videos soon find themselves out of business for dubious reasons. It is therefore difficult to establish an economically justified correlation between the corporate identity of the advertisers, commercial status of the products, and the artists who promote them. This logic of the fusion of music videos and traditional TV commercials, especially in turbo folk music videos, thus reflects the chaotic circumstances in the music industry and the Serbian economy in general. On the global level, both within and outside the post-Yugoslav migrant communities, the turbo folk variant of cosmopolitanism has made this music a rare, globally recognizable cultural phenomenon associated with Serbia. Turbo folk is paradoxically perhaps the only cultural product which connects Serbian migrant communities with Serbia proper, the audiences across the borders of the newly established post-Yugoslav states, and their migrant communities between themselves. The main hubs for these exchanges are probably the turbo folk nightclubs in Vienna, Munich, Frankfurt, Zurich, and other major cities with sizable gastarbeiter population from former Yugoslavia. The club's activities are also seen as a way to compensate the relative invisibility of the migrant population in the public sphere of the host countries with often very loud turbo folk music. Turbo folk's regionalism is therefore a loose and shifting transnational association defined through the inversion of this music from a marker of backwardness and primitivism to self-exoticizing label of passion and emotion, some things that the host countries in the West seemingly fail to offer to the immigrants. Like in Stoja's song Europa. It has been noted that few public figures have made a greater contribution to overcoming post-Yugoslav war tensions than the turbo folk celebrities like Dragana Mirković, Indira Radić, or Jelena Krleuša, who often perform in transnational settings for predominantly migrant audiences. Their efforts to expand their fan base across the national and cultural borders has played a significant role in such developments. When it emerged in the early 1990s, turbo folk was often associated with porn nationalism and primitive chauvinism. Nowadays, it is often perceived as a major factor of stability in the post-war Balkans. Slovenian sociologist Rastko Močnik noted in one interview in 2005, "Sometimes I listen to the Halo Pink show and I am fascinated with the tune-ins such as I'm calling from Switzerland and with this song I want to say hi to my aunt in Vienna, grandmother in Vranje, sister in Sydney and brother in Philadelphia. And if we look at Pink as the Balkan MTV, we may say that it is integrative because it not only connects the people from former Yugoslavia but beyond that area. Balkan turbo folk is tightly connected with the Turkish turbo folk, which is in turn connected to Arabic pop, which means that there is a cultural region of turbo folk which encompasses the culturally oldest region in Europe. That is a very interesting peripheral anti-imperialist endeavor where Pink is the Balkan representative." End quote from Rastko Močnik. According to cultural theorist Uroš Čvoro, originating in the unique ideological position of Yugoslavia between East and West and between socialism and capitalism, popular music became a powerful symbolic mobilizer. Music became the stage on which collective identity was forged after World War II and the premise on which national differences were constructed during the wars in the 90s. Paradoxically, it remains the only shared culture in the region. The career of Goran Bregović largely conforms to the already mentioned Moti Regev's model of transformation of ethno-national cultural uniqueness in musical traditions through global popular music. But the appropriation and domestication of hip-hop in our region might support Regev's observation even better. Over the past 3 decades, hip-hop culture has been discussed both in pop cultural and academic contexts as one of the most symptomatic phenomena disclosing the deep-seated controversies of the American society. At the same time, its global appropriation and media visibility throughout the planet still makes it one of the most striking facets of the contemporary globalized culture. What started in the middle 1970s in the South Bronx and other deprived neighborhoods of New York is today a worldwide youth culture, voicing a wide spectrum of political allegiances. In its symbolic struggle for the cultural autonomy, simple imitation of the mother American hip-hop culture is rejected in favor of creative integration into the host cultures. With its roots in devastated North American urban landscape, hip-hop has had a strong resonance among a generation which experienced the chaos of post-socialist transition at an early age. Young people with limited and decreasing sense of safety, stability, and opportunities for success and overall prosperity. As elsewhere in the world, hip-hop gives voice to the marginalized and to those who identify with the marginalized. In post-socialist contexts marred by corruption, poverty, instability, and oppression, hip-hop has offered, albeit illusory sense of hope that such circumstances could be somehow transcended. Although the initial fascination with hip-hop dates back in the 1980s, the first wave of Serbian hip-hop performers who actually had music releases peaked in 1997-98, which partly coincided with the mass demonstrations and intense political struggles against Milošević's regime. In such circumstances, local rappers could easily associate their social position with that of the unprivileged African-American youth. Moreover, this identification began to embrace satirical approaches to the standard tropes of underprivilege, such as poverty, deprivation, isolation, guns, violence, drug addiction, law enforcement, etc., epitomized by the band Bad Copy, and associated acts from South Central Cottage, otherwise a remote northerly neighborhood of Belgrade, or the popular Montenegrins, natives of Kotor in Montenegro. The second and very prominent wave of Serbian hip-hop was associated with the launch of the record label Basivity Music, from Belgrade in 2002. Basivity was dedicated to promoting only Serbian, Bosnian, and Croatian rap acts. The true expansion of hip-hop culture in Serbia followed their first releases, including the first album by the rap duo VIP, who captured the prevailing state of mind among the Serbian youth. Hunger for material wealth and social status attainable only through accumulation of material wealth. Both with his music releases and his success in a variety of television reality shows, former member of this crew, rapper Juice, came to epitomize the evolving relationship between hip-hop and the so-called diesel culture, subculture of the 1990s. Juice's hip-hop reassessment of the legacy of the Serbian neo-folk music genres has found resonance in the so-called turbotronic scene, which can generally be described as a music phenomenon in which performers combine turbo folk with alternative music forms. The name comes from the title of the 2017 documentary film directed by Stevan Spasić and produced by Vice Serbia. Turbotronic performers do not have much in common, either musically or ideologically. The only thing that they share is appreciation of turbo folk, and they mostly use it to challenge the urban cultural elites, their taste, authority, and legitimacy. Described by Dragičević as a subcultural centaur, Serbian version of trap embodies the harmonious marriage contracted between hip-hop and turbo folk cultures. as we have seen after a history of flirtations and courtships not without controversy. The currently active generation of Serbian rappers includes acts who have forged a close alliance with the homegrown neo-folk aesthetics in a manner hardly conceivable and certainly hardly acceptable by the more conservative fractions of the old-school Serbian hip-hop. In other words, those more loyal to their African-American role models. One of the main points of criticism of this wave in Serbian hip-hop is the perceived presence of an official language, a standardized version of the language cleansed from local vernaculars, in a straightforward attempt to reach the widest audiences possible. Namely, these rappers do not mystify their goals. Commercial success is their primary concern. During the 1990s, in the era of blossoming informal economy and organized crime, many neighborhoods of Serbian cities came under control of local crime figures, often presenting themselves and seen by others as protectors of the poor and deprived. Young people fascinated with these gangbangers, in addition to this fascination, shared preferences for turbo folk music, street hustling, gyms and bodybuilding, beautiful girls, fast cars, expensive sporting gear, and bling-bling lifestyle in general. In the Afro-American context, bling-bling, celebration of luxury and high life, addresses those who are denied traditional paths to positive self-image, assuming that self and social esteem can only be achieved through expensive lifestyle as a coping strategy. Mainstream hip-hop thus becomes just another form of escapism, as successful and super-rich rappers invite their audiences to identify with an absurd and largely staged life of luxury which ordinary people will never experience. In the Serbian context, the so-called diesel subculture was a local response to the overall criminalization of the society. Its aesthetics and values stood close to the contemporary gangsta attitude of the American inner cities of the West Coast and across the American South. What gangbangers, diesels, their girlfriends, and gangster rappers had in common was the conviction that living well is the best revenge. While the current stars of IDJ production and other subcultural centaurs celebrate in their endeavors the firm alliance forged between hip-hop and turbo folk, the old-school Serbian rapper Ajsni Grutin, under the moniker Ajsni Gucci, sums up their preoccupation in 11 words. Real hip-hop: cocaine, Armani, whiskey, boot, champagne, diamonds, Ferrari, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi. I am using these illuminating thoughts to actually conclude this talk. Many thanks for your attention.
Any questions from the audience? I have one. Where does the Slovenian artist Senida fit into this context as one of the biggest stars right now?
Well, I just gave a lecture. You should put it. You should put her in a contest yourself, or read a book if you're not sure. I mean, she's certainly part of this regional landscape of this fruitful marriage between hip hop and turbo folk. I mean, I have nothing more to say. She's obviously, the last slide, she's recently had a concert with Lepa Brena, so she's kind of, on the one hand, celebrating this neo-folk tradition, identifying with it, embracing it, celebrating it, so to speak. So basically, it's a fine illustration of this kind of influences between these meta-genres, as I said, that I'm discussing in the book.
Thank you.
Maybe it's not your theme, but I'd like to ask you about Vojvodina, which is also a part of Serbia, and the phenomena of Brata Vranišević. How do you put their role in this music scene in Serbia?
Bata Vranišević. Well, Laboratorio Zvuka is the band, of course, founded by brothers Vranišević. It's not a group that I don't think I'm even mentioning them in the book, but they are a kind of an exceptional case between so to speak, a fusion between the Novi Sad conceptual experimental art scene and the rock scene of practically Yugoslavia, because they were not only a Novi Sad music phenomenon, they were active throughout the country, they were very popular, also active in different fields. They did a lot of television music, movie soundtracks, and they were a versatile bunch of experimental minds. Maybe I would even dare to say the Serbian counterpart to Bulldozer, but simply they were not really a part of this story, because I'm focusing on Belgrade here, and maybe a band from Novi Sad would from this perspective, be interesting only if they shot music videos in Belgrade. I do have Novi Sad bands, but I mention them when they appear in a certain setting in Belgrade in their videos. So I don't have a better answer right now. But certainly they are interesting. I mean, Bata Vranišević and yeah.
Okay, if there are no more questions, we continue at 4:45. Thank you.
Thanks. The book is also available at the Library of FDV, Faculty of Social Sciences, which I strongly recommend to every media professional. And this one goes to NUK, so if you maybe use libraries still, just to know.